Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston and Swithun Dobson for episode 79 of the Lyceum Roundtable. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Locals. And you can support me on Locals, Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and make sure to check out my Substack as well for other articles and content that I produce. So, in light of Biden and the Democratic establishment, or more accurately speaking, the military-industrial complex establishment's goal to have World War III with Russia, or at least a Cold War 2.0, which could easily escalate to that, the warning that was made by William Graham Sumner in 1898, reflecting on the American-Spanish War, I think is apropos. The basic premise, and we can get into this a little bit later, is that all of those elements of Spain proper that led to its imperial rise, led to its fall to being such a rump state that America could thrash in the 19th century. He says this. Let's see, where were we? Self-government. Speaking of Spain, he says, Spain, had as much self-government as any country in Europe at the beginning of the 16th century. The union of the smaller states into one big one gave an impulse to her national feelings and national development. The discovery of America put into her hands the control of immense territories. National pride and ambition were stimulated. Then came the struggle with France for world dominion, which resulted in absolute monarchy and bankruptcy for Spain. She lost self-government and saw her resources spent on interests which were foreign to her. But she could talk about an empire on which the sun never set and boast of her colonies, her gold mines, her fleets and armies and debts. She had a glory, pride, mixed, of course, with defeat and disaster, such as must be experienced by any nation on that course of policy. And she grew weaker in her industry and commerce and poorer in the status of her population all the time. She has never been able to recover real self-government yet. If we Americans believe in self-government, why do we let it slip away from us? Why do we barter it away from military glory as Spain did? Now, this was true of 1898. It's certainly true as of 2023. And what many people might not know is that this position that William Graham Sumner is advocating used to be the default position for Americans and specifically American policymakers. So, for example, George Washington in his farewell address talks about no entangling alliances. He says, why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? Indeed, why? And then John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, writes, but she, America, goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will commend the general cause by the governance of her voice and the benign sympathy of her example. And then he says, America's glory is not dominion. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force if she becomes interventionist. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. And so we see with Washington, Adams, and then Graham, this is a consistent theme of American policy, at least with regards to the rest of the world, like Europe and Asia. And yet we've seen not only the rejection of this, but also all of the things they said would happen. Debt, loss of freedom, forever wars. John Quincy Adams warns about the forever war. And I think that this warning is so timely in light of what we're seeing now. Keith.
Yeah, in early America, the general foreign policy consensus was that America should stay out of the affairs of Europe and Asia. Now, in part, that was because America was a weak country at the time and not able to project power on that level. The United States was always expansionist domestically in North America and in the Caribbean and all of that. And in fact, the Monroe Doctrine, that was a big part of it. The Monroe Doctrine was the idea that no other international power should have influence in the Western Hemisphere because the United States wanted to be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. But it was the consensus that European wars and Asian wars and that kind of thing were something that Americans should stay out of. And with the Spanish-American War, that policy was reversed. This was really the first time that the United States actually engaged with a continental European power as part of the colonial wars that were going on during that time period. Previously we had fought a war of independence against Britain, of course, and then the British wanted America back, and that led to the 1812 war. But this was really the first imperial war that the United States fought with another major imperial power. It's interesting to consider the legacy of Spain when we're talking about this, because at one time, Spain really was the leading world power. I mean, in the late 15th century, Spain was what Britain later became, or what America is today. Spain was the leading colonial power. That's the reason why the majority of countries in the Western Hemisphere now speak Spanish. Most of those were Spanish colonies originally. That's why the Filipinos, most of them have Spanish names because they were a Spanish colony. So Spain was this world empire that, eventually deteriorated to the point that by the 20th century, it was the equivalent of what we would today call a third world country. As one that's interested in the Spanish Civil War and the conditions associated with that, it's interesting to consider how backward Spain was in the 1930s compared to many other Western countries. I mean, Spain really was, by the standards of the time, a third world country. Even today, Spain is I wouldn't say it's a third world country, but it's not as well off financially, economically, certainly in terms of world influence, as many other European countries, Western European countries. I mean, certainly England, France, Germany, those nations, Belgium, the Netherlands. I think all of those have greater influence in the world economy than Spain. So it's really a remarkable example of how a nation can decline to the point of being essentially nothing from being the world's leading power at one point.
Right. And to also add to that, Britain, which at the time was at the height of its power when Sumner is writing this, also did the same thing that Spain did. It fell from a great height. Now, of course, Sumner died before that happened, but nonetheless, his analysis would ring true there. Swithun.
Yeah. To follow Keith with Spain even today, I just had a quick check. Spain is down as the GDP per capita, and whether that's a great measure or not is another question. Is 22nd in Europe, which is lower than Cyprus, and also the Czech Republic. And considering the Czech Republic was in the Eastern Bloc for a long time, that's pretty decent from the Czechs' perspective, and not really the Spanish. Something I found interesting, which is a slightly different point than you were going at with Sumner's article, is how everybody, he says, in America at the time had gone in line with the Spanish-American War. So to quote, the press, the platform, and the pulpit have all fallen under this vice, and there's evidence that the university also, which ought to be the last citadel of truth, is succumbing to it likewise. I have no doubt that the conservative classes of this country will yet look back with regret to the acquiescence in the events of 1898 and the doctrines and the precedents which have been silently established. Is that, even if people at the time thought this was a bad idea, they thought, oh, well, hang on, we really ought to acquiesce and be quiet about this. That, whilst not a war related, I thought that was very much appropriate with respect to the whole coronavirus and lockdown response, where literally everybody, with the exception of probably John MacArthur, of anybody vaguely notable, just shut up and just acquiesced and bent over for everything that the state wanted to do. It would be interesting though, and I think this is Sumner would be probably deeply dismayed by this. I mean, how? Now I don't know this because I maybe you do, but it'd be interesting. How is the Spanish-American War generally perceived by historians and the sort of classes in America? Is it looked on relatively favorably?
Well, okay.
No, because all I was going to say was, if so, Sumner's claim that they'll look back with regret would seem to be false. So I'm just wondering what the historical view of
right.
Is.
So in brief, the pre-2011 left, the actually anti-globalist left, to the extent that I talked about it in the sort of broader sense that we find familiar with Howard Zinn and the People's History of America, just one other colonial war that America's been fighting for centuries. Now I don't think they talk about it much at all. And as far as like establishment figures and conservative figures, it's pretty much totally forgotten. I mean, nobody, the libertarians, but again, they're not establishment and they're not mainstream conservative voices. Nobody talks about it. It's completely forgotten. The only time I've ever remember it being discussed was by these far left anti-imperialist historians. Would you agree with that assessment, Keith?
Yeah, as one who has a graduate degree in history, and with my area of specialization was U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. What I have noticed is that, as Todd was saying, this war is treated almost like a non-event by mainstream American historians. It very rarely even enters into the history books when you're talking about U.S. foreign policy, except Todd's right that when you come to these hardcore anti-American imperialist historians like the late Howard Zinn and figures like that, yeah, they'll talk about this. But other than within that milieu, you don't really have much discussion of this. I think the mainstream, conventionally liberal historians treat it more as just a non-event. It's just something that's not considered important.
Now, real quick, the other thing too to add, Keith, is that even if Zinn covers it, people like Zinn don't view it as something unique or that stands out. So, for example, Pat Buchanan mentioned it in Republic, Not an Empire,
right,
as the turning point, like Sumner. But for Zinn and the like, it's just more of the same. They don't view it as something unique.
Yeah, they don't really view it as this transitional feature of American history, because they would view it just as just an extension of the wars with the Native American nations and that. Although it is unique because it's the first time that you see the United States really trying to build not a global empire, but an international colonial empire similar to the old European colonial empires. It's as opposed to just continental expansionism. So it is, in terms of the geopolitical ramifications of it, it is significant in that sense. It is a unique turn of events. I don't know how neocon historians treat the Spanish-American War. My guess is that they probably think it was wonderful because they just think war is wonderful, period. But but it is interesting how this war is treated almost like a non-event. And Sumner's essay is ignored as well by everyone except libertarians. It's only been in libertarian circles, libertarians with a very Ron Paul-like non-interventionist foreign policy outlook, which isn't all libertarians, but the Ron Paul type libertarians and some others, they tend to emphasize this essay quite a bit, which is the only reason I even know about it. It was through those circles that I've heard about it many years ago. And it's and Sumner, when Sumner is discussed in mainstream discourse, he's usually discussed as a reactionary social Darwinist. He's put in the category as people like Herbert Spencer. They're viewed as, well, these guys were apologists for 19th century capitalism, and they were against socialism, and they were against the labor movement. That's how Sumner is treated by mainstream historians.
Right. And I think this work is covered in Max Boot's The Savage War of Peace as a neocon. But of course, the whole premise of that book is a sort of hagiography for American interventions in order to keep, global peace. So to the extent that they are covered, yeah, I think they would be supportive of that. But what's interesting is the sort of division that we see with, because Sumner isn't really talking about how or what the operative mechanism is behind this war fever, or why are we going to war in Cuba? against Spain. He just says that the press was lying. And well, but in whose interest was it lying? And this is a sort of, I guess, to put a context to who, the faction that William Graham Sumner represents, is there's what we might call, the petite bourgeoisie and the small business owners of America. And those tend to be the people today that would say have supported Ron Paul. I think, for example, Sutton comes from that background as well. And they view these sort of foreign adventures as dangerous to their liberties, which it is, and to other liberties as well, which it is. But then they don't really seem to correctly identify the mechanism by which America is driving these imperialist policies. And this is where I think many of the left-wing critics are a little bit better, is they point to these large corporate interests like the Sugar Trust, right? I mean, Keith, you've done, like you said, you've done the Latin America U.S. foreign policy. I mean, it's all the Sugar Trust, right? Starting all these wars.
Right.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I'm trying to find an article here. I'm going to share with you guys. Maybe we can discuss it. But American foreign policy in Latin America has always been, back then and now today, has always been about two basic things. And one is to keep out the influence of European and Asian competitors, whether it's the Spanish or the Chinese or whomever. And it's also about maintaining access to the natural resources that you can find in these countries, whether it's sugar. The sugar was a big one. Also, just fruit, like the United Fruit Company was infamous in their and for their involvement in U.S. military interventions in Latin America. So it's always been these two core ideas, fused together. That is, geopolitical interests keep out these international European and Asian powers, and then maintain control over resources domestically. Cheap labor, cheap access to natural goods. Fruit plantations and coffee plantations and sugar plantations, mining, copper mines. The CIA organized coup in Chile in 1973 or 74. I think it was 74. Was organized with the assistance of the Pepsi Cola company, because Pepsi Cola has had copper mines in Chile that they would use to make the Pepsi cans, the drink cans, out of. So that this is the standard norm in American foreign policy in Latin America. And this particular war, the Spanish-American War, was really an expansion of that.
Right, and so the point that I was getting at was that a lot of these anti-interventionists on the right, which again today would be manifested in the Ron Paul libertarian movement, don't really. They either don't identify the operative force, what we would call the bourgeoisie, these large corporate interests that want access to resources overseas, or they'll point to something else. And that's part of why they don't seem to make a whole lot of progress on this front. And the idea, that lesson wasn't learned. We kept going further and further, more and more aggressive. Now, Sumner died before World War I. He died in 1910. One can only wonder what Sumner would have thought of World War I. So, let's see, Swithun, so some of your thoughts on this broader context for Sumner.
Oh, with the with sort of like the libertarian historians, I mean, it is pretty obvious. Well, it's pretty obvious why they won't go down the we've discussed before, sort of like the corporate influence line, because I think they might get better in the future, but most of them, especially more contemporary ones, probably from the 50s onwards, are still kind of in the Cold War mindset that capitalism good, business good, the state, well, socialism, however we define that, is bad. I mean, like in Fox News, for instance, oh no, the Democrats are introducing socialism. It's like, yeah, like Sweden socialist. I mean, it even if we're close to Sweden. So I think there, and as well as a lot of libertarians as well, they're very loath. In a way, theoretically they will agree, but in practice they're kind of always thinking that it's almost like the inner rand. It's like, no, it's business, it must be good somehow. in their interest. Oh, maybe they were furthering free trade with South America, or something like this. So I think that explains it. Now, whether they'll do that in the future, I'm not sure they will, at least not to the same extent, because I suppose now it's more of a culture rather than an economic sort of war, as it were. Now, of course, the libertarians always focus on economics because, well, that's kind of the foundation of it. But I think maybe in the future it'll be slightly more nuanced with the history, and I think, at least to some extent, some of the work of, well, I mean, they're somewhat strange and bad on lots of things, but something like Kevin Carson, to use him as a placeholder amongst others, and his sort of analysis of sort of the growth, well, the how the historical American economy wasn't as laissez-faire as one might think. Now, obviously, this kind of view, it does go back further, and Rothbard mentions Benjamin Tucker and various other things like that. But I mean, that kind of critique of the 19th century economy doesn't seem to have developed as much as it might. So I'm relatively optimistic that they might be able to take this on board without making it sound like they're going, well, without actually going sort of, as it were, socialist. But as to why that they do that, I think it's quite clear. But it is a big blind spot.
So I have two further questions or points to clarify for you, Swithun. One is, well, okay, post 1945, the military-industrial complex and Eisenhower's warning, we can argue that now there's a built-in drive within the state to keep these wars ongoing. But beginning in the Spanish-American War and then up to the end of World War II, this sort of internationalist push was purely from these large corporations. So after World War I, Wilson wanted to join the League of Nations, but he was defeated. The American population, even most politicians, were not willing to even conceive of being the world's policeman. Now, of course, that changes after 1945. So I do think that this blind spot is problematic because of the influence these large corporations had at the beginning. But then the second thing is, there was a chance that libertarians could have done this, because I remember reading a short book that Rothbard wrote where he pointed about the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Fords and their conspiratorial elements to get America involved in World War II, which is largely forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly there. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, some of them do. They do go that way. I think to some extent, the libertarians. Let's take, for instance, well, I mean, it's kind of obvious why the beltways don't go that way. But I mean, even things like the Mises Institute, amongst others, I think probably wants to try and avoid the CIA's favorite label of conspiracy theorist, and so doesn't want to go that way, even though it is blatantly obvious that, in a sense, well, to use Kerry Bolton's term, the revolution from above. Is it that they've all got down and decided this great, like, long-term plan? Well, no, probably not. But they could see that it's going to be in their interest. I mean, for instance, it was obvious. I mean, if you're an international company, you're going to like the fact that you can basically outsource the cost of securing your shipments onto the US Navy if the relative tax burden is lower than what you would have to pay for. And so basically you're socializing the costs of keeping the shipping lanes open. I mean, it's obvious why that's going to be in your interest. I mean, related to that, I mean, even today, it's kind of obvious. I mean, if you look at like the Brexit vote in 2016, it was the corporations that liked this sort of expansionist bloc were the multinational ones who were operating in various jurisdictions. The independent, the more sort of British-based, export-based companies, JCB being the best example, probably were opposed to the EU because of the regulatory costs, probably because they didn't do simply enough international trade for the additional costs of the EU to cause them much of a problem, at least not comparative, and of course it would keep out competition. So So yeah, I think that's the way, and I think there's kind of a PR thing. I mean, they've just done so. I mean, the state has done so well with labeling anybody a conspiracy theorist and making it stick. Unless, of course, they're talking about the Russia Gate and stuff, and of course, well, that's a true conspiracy. People don't touch it. I mean, Oh, what the heck's the guy called? I can't remember. The American guy is in Japan who writes quite a bit and has lots of. I can't remember his name. He was saying about how the Hollywood and the whole media setup are all set up to deride anything conspiracy. Now, of course, there's bad conspiracy theories and there's better conspiracy theories, but I think that there's that, because I mean the libertarians are hardly the most group with the highest amount of street cred. So if you start going about how this is actually a conspiracy of the corporations, then that might not go down to it. That said, of course, the left are perfectly happy in playing that game, but then they're not really conspiracy theorists. They're just looking out for the best of everybody. So I mean I'm not defending it, but I mean it's definitely there in Rothbard. I mean Rothbard wrote The Conspiracy Theory of History. It was essay title that he did. So he was certainly not opposed to going that way, and he was right to do so. But again, I think it's a case of, oh no, business is good, and therefore we can't really criticize them. It's kind of like the if you pack your libertarians in a corner, they just turn into Rand. I think that's really what ends up happening.
All right, now Keith, you wanted to discuss the American Anti-Imperialist League.
Yeah, it's important in any discussion of the Spanish-American War to point out that there was opposition to this. There was an organization that was founded for the specific purpose of opposing the Spanish-American War, in particular the American annexation of the Philippines. Like previously, the Philippines had been the colonial possession of Spain. And one of the things that came out of the Spanish-American War is that the Philippines became American possessions. Of course, they later became independent, but that was what was going on at the time. And there was actually an organization called the American Anti-Imperialist League that was founded at the time of the Spanish-American War for the purpose of opposing this kind of approach to foreign policy. And the Anti-Imperialist League was not a Marxist or far-left organization. Nowadays, when people hear the term anti-imperialist, they often think of communism or far left anti-imperialism, and that's certainly a brand of anti-imperialism. But the membership in the Anti-Imperialist League represented fairly mainstream Americans for the time. For instance, Benjamin Harrison, who was a former U.S. president, he was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. Sumner, whom we've been discussing, was a member. Henry James, he was a prominent literary figure in the United States. Sam Gompers, he was a labor leader. Andrew Carnegie, he was a business leader. Grover Cleveland, he was another former U.S. president. Mark Twain, he's arguably the most famous of any of these people still today. John Dewey, he was a prominent intellectual at the time, and he was a philosopher of education. But these were all, very prominent mainstream Americans, politicians, literary figures, business leaders, labor leaders, who were opposed to this kind of, to the United States adopting this kind of expansionist, colonialist foreign policy that the European countries at the time were known for. Not just Spain, but really all of the major European powers. They had their international colonial empires. That this was during the same period as the scramble for Africa, where they were trying to divide up Africa into sectors that would be under the domination of various colonial powers. And the Anti-Imperialist League was actually warning against this. So it's interesting to consider, what the legacy of the Anti-Imperialist League has been, and how many of the things that they predicted actually came into being, like we've been saying, as far as Sumner's famous essay or somewhat famous essay. And I think it's interesting to point out, as Todd was saying earlier on, this is a major part of the American political tradition, or a major part of American history. What's happened in recent generations is that the history of American foreign policy has largely been dominated to a large degree by apologists for American empire building, with the exception of these far left types like Howard Zinn. You have these apologists for American empire building who talk about how we had all these great wars. We had World War II was the good war. World War I, that was great too. And you certainly your neocon historians really put that spin on it, but even your mainstream liberal progressive historians have this same basic outlook as well. And I know some years ago there was an article in, I guess it was in Forbes magazine, talking about this. They were saying that, isn't it wonderful that we fought World War I? Isn't it wonderful that we fought all these other wars? That's made America the great nation it is today. So yeah, but there was always opposition to this. There wasn't a consensus, universal consensus in favor of this kind of policy, even when these events were happening.
Right. The other thing that's interesting, so if we look at the rise of this mentality in the U.S. political system, which at the time in the 1890s was completely contrary to all prior received wisdom from George Washington down to William Graham Sumner. And I think it's interesting. So on the one hand, we've already discussed the large corporate interests, the trusts, if you will, their interest in all this. But there's another interest as well as pushing these imperial forces, and they team up with the trusts. And it's a way you think it wouldn't happen, right? But it's really strange. This is also the heyday of the American progressive movement. And progressivism, think of like Woodrow Wilson, make the world safe for democracy. Think about FDR. I mean, Mr. Uber progressive, he's trying to form, the United Nations, right? To finish the failure that was the League of Nations. Now, these people are, of course, concerned with economic pressures. I do think the corporations do lean on them. For example, Anthony Sutton wrote a book about how the New Deal was in part the result of these corporate ultimatums to FDR, but also they had their own philosophical justification. These poor benighted masses need to be enlightened with progressivism. And so you'd see that, like, domestically, the progressives and the trusts would fight each other. They always seem to agree on international policy. And then, of course, what Sutton brings to the table is he's like, well, look, the U.S. corporations were funding the Soviets. They helped. We saw them build China up in real time. And it's like, what is the common factor here between the progressives and these what Sutton calls the monopoly capitalists? And what I think is the common factor and why they often work together is that they both want this like rationally planned scientific society. They both think that science is irresistible, and they only differ on how best to manage it. Keith.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, the relationship between the progressive movement and corporations and imperialism, because during this period, as you were saying, this is when the progressive movement was at its height. It's known as the progressive era. Social historians of the United States will often divide up different American history into different time periods, and this late 19th century, early 20th century is often referred to as the progressive era. And it was a time when a lot of policies that we would think of as quote unquote liberal policies were being implemented in the United States, like labor regulation, and then eventually women's suffrage, and the income tax, the progressive income tax, and all of these kinds of things. But at the same time, the United States was engaged in empire building and becoming a world, a prototype for a world empire, abandoning the previous foreign policy framework. And business interests were always central to that. It's always interesting. It's been interesting to see how business and supposed progressives work hand in hand to expand the state and expand empire building, and we see the same thing going on today. I mean, it's the exact same thing is happening now, where you see on one hand these corporations on one hand, and then you see these woke progressives on the other hand doing exactly this. They're working hand in hand to promote more, ostensibly left-wing domestic policies. You start to see corporate backing for Black Lives Matter and Rainbow Pride and all these kinds of things. And at the same time, all of these same sectors are really becoming very gung-ho about the war in Ukraine and all of that as well. In fact, it's become, among progressives nowadays, it's become sort of a fashion symbol to have your Ukrainian flag next to your rainbow flag, next to your BLM banner, next to your, one of those the things with the symbols with all the religions coexist and all of that kind of stuff. So it's like progressive imperialism has always been a thing. Going all the way back to the progressive era.
Right. Swithun, any thoughts?
That's exactly what Sumner notes here. I know he doesn't name progressives by name, but it was like, we have to rule their country. We have to, I remember the exact part. Basically, we have to, basically because they can't run themselves properly, we'll need the Americans to provide enlightened rule for them. We can't just leave them to rule themselves. Well, no, they just wouldn't be able to do that. Have to do it and have the Americans do it, which is very much the sort of like progressive way of doing it. It's a centralizing tendency, and you have to make everywhere the same, and everyone has to be ruled by the rule of law, as whatever the American industrial complex calls the law, you can't have separate states. Backward states are basically evil. They're not just sort of doing things badly. They have to be subdued and encouraged, inverted commas, to be an enlightened state, and that's what Sumner makes a case. Well, basically says that that's what they're doing. At least some of the justifications used at the time for the Spanish-American War. So yeah, given what Keith said with respect to this is the progressive era. I mean, it isn't. It isn't surprising at all that they would intend to do that.
So yeah, I did find the piece that you were looking for.
Oh yeah, where is it?
Right here. See it highlighted?
Yeah. So we're told by, just to read, we're told by the imperialists that these people of the former Spanish possessions are not fit for liberty and self-government, and that it is rebellion for them to resist our beneficence, and we must send fleets and armies to kill them, and if they do it, that we must devise a government for them and minister it ourselves, that we may buy them or sell them as we please and dispose of their trade for our own advantage. But what is that but the policy of Spain and her tendencies? What can we expect as a consequence of it? Nothing but that which will bring us where Spain is now. I mean, that's just sort of liberal internationalism back in the late 19th century. Where's Madeleine Albright when you need her to come defend the Spanish-American War?
Yeah.
I mean, it's exactly the same playbook, which just reminds me as well, though. I mean, even though I say a lot of the time the world is basically still living in the shadow of World War II, in a sense, really, it is in the shadow of the 19th century and the progressive movement, because the progressive movement in Western Europe and the USA have basically control all the major organs of power, and so there's no real change, which isn't surprising then that imperialism and foreign venturism is still popular in that way, because effectively we still have a progressive society. Now, whether that is an inevitable result of technological progress, as Ted Kaczynski would probably claim, is another question. But it's still very much to seem that whilst very living in the sort of post-Second World War version of it, it is still fundamentally a progressive society.
Well, what's interesting too, I finally found what I was looking for. the monograph by Rothbard. It was called Wall Street, Banks, and American Foreign Policy. And he goes into all of the stuff, the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, all this classic stuff. And I mean, he even mentioned Cecil Rhodes's Roundtable, which of course was mentioned by Carroll Quigley, who was one of the professors for Bill Clinton. And so it's really strange to me, and this again is a question just to you again, Swithin, this could be labeled conspiracy theory land, but maybe Rothbard was just more bold. But I mean, Rothbard went here, and it seems to be like this has all been kind of forgotten.
Oh yeah, very much so. But with Rothbard and sort of contemporary libertarian movements, there's sort of various eras of Rothbard that you can use. So for instance, like early Rothbard, who is kind of on the side of the he supports with the Black Panthers and the far left, he's kind of sort of ignored to a large extent, except of course the left libertarians are always very much early Rothbard. In a way, Rothbard ends up sort of like being a quasi cultic figure, and then he kind of like founds a new religion, and then there's various cults that focus on various strands of his thought, so yeah, I mean he does very much go there, and I just think just for general sort of palatability reasons, that sort of Rothbard is ignored, and because Rothbard wrote so much, you can still claim, we're kind of the true Rothbardians. We're looking at America's Great Depression, look, the Austrian business cycle theory, and doing kind of things which are somewhat less, well, in a way, less divisive, because in a way it's easy to make the case, well, relatively easy to make the case that like central banking and the Fed, etc., is kind of bad for business. I mean, it's good for the banksters, but it's bad for regular kind of petty bourgeoisie types, which is true, it is. But going after like ostensible private firms themselves is kind of a step too far. And so it's, because there's so much of Rothbard you can go on, you can still claim, oh yes, we're in the Rothbardian camp, and avoiding. I mean, some have done it. I mean, the guy I remembered, which they helped me on the chat to remind me, James Corbett, who apparently is Canadian and not American, but I can't tell the difference, is someone who very much continues in that that vein of well, you could argue conspiracy wrote some interesting stuff with respect to the influence of BlackRock and their rise. So they do it, but it just tends to be individual, more fringe figures than some of the major organizations, because I don't know of any major sort of relatively major libertarian organization that would do that.
Right. So Keith, back in the day, because one of the things that first drew me into libertarianism was this kind of like robust historical revisionism. Obviously, Rothbard we've discussed, but also Ralph Raico, Jeff Riggenbach, and others. That seems to have been entirely, and that's of course how we heard about William Graham Sumner in the first place. But that seems to have been largely sidelined. Do you have any comments on why you think that's happened? Was it just something that older men did and the new generation just kind of didn't carry it on?
Yeah. I from what I've seen of the way libertarianism has gone in recent years, like in the last 10 years or so, at least in the United States, it seems like it's just become a microcosm of the wider American society, in the sense it's just all about culture war politics. Like you have this C4SS group, Center for a Stateless Society, and they pride themselves on being leftist libertarians. And I think they may lay claim to the 60s era Rothbard that Swithin was talking about. But they are basically, woke left. They're almost like a woke left parody group or something. I've also noticed that the Mises Institute crowd has more gone in the other direction. They're clearly trying to appeal to the based rather than the woke. And then you have these more centrist, what they used to call neo-libertarians. I don't know what you call them now, but the more Cato Institute types and these DC think tank types of libertarians. And I think in all of their cases, it seems to be more about aligning themselves with this or that mainstream political faction, the one that they find the least palatable or the most palatable, the least threatening or whatever, the one that's least socialist or least fascist or, least whatever they think the main enemy is. And yeah, frankly, I think all that's just really boring. I mean, that's my personal view of it. The libertarian commentators today that I like are the ones like James Corbett that Swithun was mentioning earlier that do explore some of these more obscure but I think more interesting issues. I mean, to me, nothing is more boring than a debate between the center right and the center left because they're just different degrees of the same thing. I mean, when you get into debates between libertarians and Marxists and fascists and these other tendencies, then you're dealing with radically different paradigms. So yeah, I mean, I think libertarianism has just been largely co-opted by the mainstream culture in various ways, and libertarianism is just split off into where they're all the different libertarian groups are just appendages to the major tribes, the blue tribe, the red tribe, and all of that.
Okay, so I think one thing that we've been sort of walking around is the idea that there have been times and places in the history where the left will point the finger at these sort of, the true power behind the throne when it comes to these foreign policy conflicts. So the large Fortune 500 companies, then later the military-industrial complex. And there were times and places when at least some libertarians or some what we might call libertarian adjacent types would say that. So, Sumner sort of hints at this. Of course, Sutton gets at this. Rothbard at times gets at this. But what seems to happen is that neither side seems to be focused on this for very long in the historical time frame, which is strange in the sense that because this is the heart of the beast, this sort of like progressive political corporate alliance for world domination. And I just think what would be the best explanation for this? The explanation that I propose is that the sort of culture war as it's developed since 1945 has been to get people to commit to social values that could only exist inside the system. And so they've already implicitly bought into the system by defending these certain cultural paradigms. And it becomes less, and that's done as a way to distract people from looking at the banks, looking at these megacorps, looking at this political establishment, now the military-industrial complex. And I think we could see that in 2011 with how they subrupted the left. So that's my explanation for this inability to stay focused on the target. What do you think, Keith?
Well, right now I'm looking at the website of LewRockwell.com, which is sort of the leading paleo libertarian voice. And I notice of the articles they currently have up, they do have an article up by Pepe Escobar, and they do have an article up by Caitlin Johnstone. And both of those are, I guess they're Marxists who are very critical of American imperialism. But so they do post stuff like that. And you can find counterparts to that in the left libertarian milieu as well. But I think that there is a taboo in libertarian circles about criticizing the business class. It's for example, yesterday I saw a meme by some libertarian complaining about Donald Trump, saying, well, Donald Trump turned out to be just another socialist like every other president. And I'm like, what? Whatever you think of Donald Trump, he's not a socialist. You have to, unless you just believe anything government ever does is socialism. The post office is socialism. There's no way you can define socialism that broadly and have it have any coherent meaning. Ayn Rand had this quote, that big business was America's most persecuted minority, which is an absurd thing to say. And I think, in her case, she was someone that was actually born in the Soviet Union. So I think she just became so pathologically anti-communist that anything that criticized business was, an anathema. And she was a pretty twisted person anyway, But and I think that a lot of that has infected the libertarian milieu. That anything that speaks critically of business interest is, proto-socialism or proto-communism or something of that nature. So yeah, I think that's where a lot of this is coming from.
Swithun, what do you think?
I think the problem in the libertarian world is, to a large extent, a genealogy of how we got to where we are, which is why I went back to sort of like the 19th century. Still, under many views, is that sort of the pre sort of, well, I suppose if you go to the South, I mean, you'll go to sort of like the pre-Civil War, and then everything was fine. Some will say like the late 19th century, that was kind of the good times, and it's really the growth of the federal state and the central state, say in England, as it were, from sort of like the late 19th century onward, the early 20th century onwards, and it's due to the state. It's not down to it's not down to sort of a progressive sort of centralized bureaucratic sort of mindset, which is like the managerial revolution as such. To quote Burnham, it's just sort of like this parasitic state which is enforcing it, and so I think they're sort of their lack of good genealogy as to the reasons, intellectual and sort of actual historical, as to how we got here. I mean, this is interesting why, for instance, Sean Gabb tries to make a defense of landed aristocracy, because he seems to recognize that, yeah, really you have the growth, basically the upper middle class win in the late 19th century, and eventually you have the upper middle class in power, who were, it's the merchant class. I mean, Marx was correct in the sense it was it was essentially the bourgeoisie, which it was, and things that kind of grow out of there, and the relationship with the state. I mean, in the case of England, I mean, you could definitely say, the sort of the merchant class has very much has an upper hand since like the late 17th century, and that becomes consolidated with various reform acts and things to delegitimize landed aristocracy. Not that landed aristocracy was great by any stretch of the imagination, but it shows that there is a transition to sort of like, and also Gab would argue as well that a lot of like the rationalizing of state operations in the 19th century by the Liberal Party just merely laid the groundwork for a much more efficient and oppressive state, as opposed to just focusing on, well, historically we've always kind of done this, and old liberties in England, and that kind of kept the state smaller. So whilst you would have to do like a more thoroughgoing sort of genealogy, I think that's where the problem is. And mine isn't perfect, but I think ultimately a lot of it, not to sound like a Georgist, goes down to land acquisition, and particularly enclosures and other things like that. To the rise of sort of the rise of the corporate merchant classes. So I think I suppose it's a case of where is the original sin that got us where we are today, and I think misdiagnosing what that is then harms the analysis today.
Right. Okay. So two things. One, Terminal Philosophy was not able to join us because of power outage due to a snowstorm where he lives. So that's why we didn't see Terminal today. Second of all, final statements. I'll just say that this sort of policy, this sort of understanding of American policy that goes back to George Washington, John Quincy Adams, and is eloquently stated by William Graham Sumner, and continues in some form, through Anthony Sutton down to Ron Paul, really needs to be recovered, because it not learning that lesson has been catastrophic to America with regards to its liberties at home and the consequences that we are incurring abroad. So, final thoughts, Keith.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that this part of American history and American political traditions are usually obscured, and when they're mentioned, it's only to lambaste them. In fact, in mainstream discourse, being called an isolationist is considered a slur. It's like being called a racist or something like that. And it's a shame because these early criticisms of American expansionism were fairly on the money in terms of the consequences they predicted. Certainly, William Graham Sumner's essay, "The Conquest of America by Spain," was in that vein. And even if you go back and you look at many of the critics of American entry into World War II, like the America First Committee, I mean, clearly their arguments were not nearly as all wet as often claimed as well. So it's a good idea to go back and revisit some of this history and see what some of these folks had to say.
All right, Swithun, final thoughts.
I broadly agree with Keith. I mean, my knowledge of sort of the War of 1898 is sketchy at best. So it's very much a forgotten era. And I think we need not to be as optimistic as Sumner seems to be, that people will look back on this and with regret that they supported X war or X intervention. Because if it's bad, it'll just be memory hold. Or otherwise it'll be given a particularly glossy sheen to say, well, we already did the best thing as we could. That's kind of like, well, the coronavirus backtracked is, well, we're doing the best we could. And even if you were correct, you were correct for the wrong reasons. You're just a rube, So I think just be eternally vigilant about that. That'd be my final thing.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith Preston. Thank you, Swithun. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.